My name is Janet, and if you told me a year ago that my wedding day would ignite the coldest, most calculated rage of my life, I would have laughed at you. I believed weddings were for joy, for unity, for the blending of families. I believed in the idea that no matter what petty grievances or misunderstandings existed, your family showed up when it mattered. And I was foolish enough to believe my family loved me enough to stand beside me. For months, my parents and my sister Allison had been teasing me about some big surprise they had planned for my wedding. My mother would smile with that secretive glint in her eye. My father would smirk and pat my hand, and Allison, always the one for drama, would say, "You'll never see it coming, Jan." I pictured a vintage car to drive away in, or maybe a performance from a local jazz band. Never, not for 1 second, did I imagine that the surprise would be their absence. The wedding itself was set in Charleston, South Carolina, in a historic brick church with tall, stained glass windows and creaking pews that had probably held more tears and whispered prayers than I could ever count. I had rented a beautiful white-columned house nearby for $2,400 a month to host the reception afterward. I wanted everything perfect, not flashy, but timeless. I'd spent $18,000 of my own savings to make it happen, right down to the gold-rimmed china and the fresh magnolia garlands on the tables. On the morning of the ceremony, the air was humid but sweet with the scent of jasmine. My hair was pinned, my dress pressed, and I was ready far too early. Every time the church doors creaked open, my heart jumped. I was sure it would be them, my father straightening his tie, my mother adjusting her hat, Allison swanning in with that self-satisfied smile. But the guests filled the pews, and still they didn't appear. By the time I was standing at the altar, the absence felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I told myself they'd be late, that maybe they had car trouble or some last-minute emergency. I clung to that hope through the vows, the exchange of rings, the kiss. But when we walked back down the aisle and out into the sunlight, they still weren't there. Melissa, my maid of honor, caught my arm before I could get into the waiting car. She looked pale, almost guilty. Without saying a word, she unlocked her phone and pressed it into my hands. The screen lit up with a video. There they were, my parents and Allison standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, the Paris sky a bright, perfect blue. My father's arm was around my mother, and Allison was holding a flute of champagne. My father's voice came through the speakers, unmistakable. "She won't be hurt by this." My mother laughed, Allison grinned, and the video ended abruptly. For a moment, the world around me went muffled, like I'd been shoved underwater. I couldn't hear the chatter of the guests, the distant honk of traffic, or even my new husband's voice calling my name. All I could hear was the echo of that sentence, "She won't be hurt by this." It was so smug, so certain, like they believed my love for them was bulletproof. I felt my jaw tighten, my fingernails biting into my palm. They were wrong. I was hurt, yes, but hurt was only the surface. Beneath it, something darker was coiling itself together. Something that wanted to lash out, not cry. I didn't contact them. I didn't send a single text or make a single call. When we got to the reception, I plastered on a smile so convincing that even Melissa seemed startled. I danced, I laughed, I posed for photographs with my in-laws. And later, when I posted a set of those photos online, the comments began flooding in. Within 24 hours, I had 350 missed calls, my parents, my sister, even some of their friends. I didn't answer any of them, let them squirm. Let them wonder how much I'd seen, what I knew. If they thought their stunt was harmless, they were about to learn just how badly they'd miscalculated. That night, after my husband fell asleep, I sat in the rented reception house with a glass of wine, staring at the magnolia garland still draped across the dining room table. The scent was fading, petals curling at the edges. I thought about how those flowers had been cut from their roots, how their beauty was just the last gasp before decay. That's how I felt, cut off, ornamental, something to be admired but not valued. But here's the thing about cutting something from its roots. If it has seeds, it can still grow again, somewhere else, under its own control. And I was already thinking about the soil I'd need for the next chapter of my life. Revenge wasn't a foreign idea to me. I just never needed it before, but now it seemed inevitable, almost natural. If they could humiliate me on the most important day of my life, I could dismantle what was important to them. I wasn't going to scream or plead or demand explanations. They'd expect that. No, I was going to be quiet, patient, strategic. Aggression, when it's silent, is more dangerous than when it's loud. I knew their weaknesses. My parents' antique shops were their pride, their livelihood. Allison's social image was her entire identity. She lived for being admired. And I have been a part of all of it for years, which meant I knew exactly where to strike. Sitting there, swirling the wine in my glass, I pictured my family's faces when they realized they'd lost something they cared about. I imagined their voices trembling the way mine had in the moments after I saw that video. I thought about the way my father had looked into the camera, confident that I wouldn't be hurt. I smiled then, not the smile of a bride on her wedding day, but the smile of a woman who'd found a new purpose. When I finally went to bed, I slipped under the covers without a sound. My husband murmured something in his sleep and reached for me, his arm warm across my waist. He didn't know that while he dreamed, I was wide awake, mapping out the first steps of a plan that would take months, maybe years, to unfold. They thought they'd surprised me. They had, but the real surprise was coming for them. And when it did, they would wish they'd stayed home and shown up like decent people. In Charleston that night, the air was thick with the scent of the sea, and the jasmine still blooming along the wrought iron fences. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. I lay there listening, counting each chime like a promise. Time was on my side, and I would use every second of it. I moved into my husband's house in Savannah, Georgia, tall, weathered Victorian, painted in shades of sage and cream, with wraparound porches and oak floors that seemed to whisper with every step. The place had character, warmth, history, but I barely noticed any of it. Every time the floor creaked under my feet, I heard my family's laughter echoing in my head, that smug Paris video looping over and over like a wound that refused to close. Weeks passed, and not a single apology crossed my phone screen. Then one afternoon, a text came through from my sister Allison. We thought you'd laugh about it. Why so dramatic? Dramatic. I had spent $18,000 on a wedding without taking a dime from them. And they'd chosen to sip champagne under the Eiffel Tower instead of sitting in a pew. Dramatic? No, I was calculating. That night, I pulled a leather-bound journal from the bottom drawer of my desk, not to record memories, but to draw up blueprints. The first page was dated and underlined. Operation Silence Before the Storm. Revenge doesn't come cheap. I set aside $5,000 from my savings without hesitation. My husband Nathan assumed I was budgeting for post-wedding stress therapy, which I let him believe. He had no idea I was about to weaponize the patience of a saint with the precision of a surgeon. The first thing I needed was information. People underestimate how easy it is to find cracks in the armor of even the most polished families. I started small, checking public records in Charlotte, North Carolina, where my parents had built their little empire of antique stores. 6 shops in total, the largest one in Columbia, South Carolina. I knew that one was their crown jewel, the shop my father bragged about to his friends, the one that made them real money, in their words. While Nathan worked late, I combed through property records, business licenses, and financial filings. Every piece of information went into my journal, neatly written in black ink. Where they banked, which suppliers they used, the name of the landlord who owned their Columbia location. I learned he was a man named Harold Dempsey, mid-60s, divorced twice, known in town for hating long-term tenants who thought they owned the place. My parents had been there over 15 years. It was almost poetic. Aggression, I reminded myself, doesn't have to be loud. It can be a quiet, invisible current beneath calm waters, waiting for the right moment to pull someone under. The second week into my research, I started planting seeds. I made a few calls to suppliers, pretending to be a curious shop owner looking for alternatives. I found out which ones were already irritated with my parents for slow payments. I hinted, without saying names, that some stores in Charlotte might be closing soon. Rumors, once loosed, take on their own lives. By the third week, Allison reached out again. This time it was a voicemail. Jan, we didn't think it was a big deal, okay? We were going to surprise you with a trip next year. You're blowing this out of proportion. I deleted the message before it finished. They still thought this was about hurt feelings. They didn't see the storm forming over their heads. Late one Friday night, I drove alone to Charlotte. The drive up I-95 was quiet, the hum of the road keeping my mind focused. I parked 2 streets over from my parents' main store and walked past it slowly. The sign in the window still read Davenport Antiques in ornate gold script. Inside, I saw my father at the counter counting cash. The same man who toasted himself in Paris while I stood alone at my own wedding. The aggression in me sharpened. I could have walked in, confronted him, screamed until the windows rattled. But that would have been giving him power. No, my revenge had to be permanent, not momentary. Back in Savannah, I called Harold Dempsey. I didn't use my real name. I told him I was a buyer representing an investment group. I asked if his Columbia property was still for sale.
He hesitated at first, then admitted he'd been trying to offload it for months.
His asking price was $320,000. I told him we could do better $280,000 in cash, fast closing.
Cash? He asked, suspicion melting into interest. Cash, I said.
30 days. That night, I took another $20,000 from savings and moved it into a separate account. I could feel Nathan's eyes on me at dinner the next night. You've been busy lately, he said carefully. I'm just putting things in order, I replied. And I was. My order. The hardest part was keeping my aggression bottled in public. Every time I went into town, every time I saw couples laughing together, every time I overheard someone mention Paris or weddings, the tension in my jaw returned. But instead of snapping, I poured that energy into my plan. The more they thought I was sulking, the more invisible I became in their world. That invisibility was my weapon. In early March, Harold accepted my offer. I wired the down payment $50,000 and set the closing date. The legal paperwork listed a holding company I'd formed under a different name, one with no obvious connection to me. The day before the closing, Allison sent a text. We're coming to Savannah next month. Let's talk. I didn't reply. The storm was too close now. Let them enjoy their last calm days. When the sale finalized, the property and by extension, their most profitable store belonged entirely to me. I didn't pop champagne. I didn't dance around the living room. I simply filed the paperwork, placed it neatly in my desk drawer, and drafted an official eviction notice. 30 days, no extensions. I signed my name at the bottom slowly, carefully, like a final brushstroke on a painting. It wasn't the end not yet, but it was the first real strike. And as I sealed the envelope, I realized I hadn't felt this level of satisfaction in years. The silence before the storm was over. The thunder was coming. The day the property became mine, the world outside looked the same, sunlight filtering through moss-covered oaks. The faint hum of traffic in Savannah, but for me, everything had shifted. On paper, I was the anonymous owner of a prime piece of commercial real estate in Columbia, South Carolina. In reality, I was holding the beating heart of my parents' business in my hands. I didn't let the satisfaction show. Revenge isn't about the quick rush, it's about drawing it out, letting it seep in like cold water until the victim realizes they're drowning. My parents had spent over 15 years operating Davenport Antiques from that building, their largest and most profitable store. They'd boasted about it at every dinner, every holiday, like it was their personal kingdom. And now, that kingdom belonged to me. The eviction notice was simple, clinical. 30 days to vacate, no extensions. Failure to comply will result in legal action. I printed it on heavy ivory paper, the kind that carried weight in the hand, and mailed it to the store in a plain white envelope, no return address. I pictured my father opening it behind the counter, his face flushing, his jaw tightening. My mother's hand flying to her chest in that dramatic way she had when she wanted attention. I imagined Allison standing there, pretending to care, but already calculating how this would make her look to her friends. 3 days later, my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring. Then a second call, then a third. On the fourth, I answered. Her voice was a jagged mix of panic and rage. You're destroying us. I didn't bother pretending to be confused. Now we're even. The silence on the line was beautiful, pure, sharp, filled with the weight of realization. She sputtered something about family, about loyalty, about how I couldn't possibly mean this. I hung up before she could finish. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the back porch. The cicadas were loud, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. I thought about the look on their faces when they realized this wasn't a bluff. They'd have to pack up 15 years of their lives' glass cabinets, mahogany tables, chandeliers, and haul it all out like beggars. The humiliation would spread quickly in Colombia. Small towns love a scandal, and this one would be irresistible. I wasn't done, not even close. Owning the building and evicting them was just the first step. Revenge, when done properly, is a series of blows, each one carefully timed so the victim never has a chance to recover before the next lands. I called Harold Dempsey, the former landlord, a week after the papers were signed. We met at a diner off I-26, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted faintly of metal. Harold was a talker. Between bites of his overcooked eggs, he told me everything: how my father had once tried to bully him into lowering rent, how my mother had thrown a tantrum when he refused to pay for roof repairs, how Allison had strutted through the shop acting like she owned the place. "I can't say I'm sorry to see them go," Harold said with a grin. "I can," I replied, smiling thinly. "But only because I'm the one making it happen," he laughed, thinking it was a joke. I didn't correct him. The next week, I started making phone calls to their suppliers, this time without hiding my identity. I let them know, casually, that Davenport Antiques was losing its flagship location and might not be able to fulfill future orders. I didn't tell them to cut my parents off. I didn't need to. Uncertainty spreads faster than any direct threat. I could feel the ripple effect beginning. By the third week, my mother broke her silence. She called from an unfamiliar number, her voice brittle. "Janet, this isn't you. This is cruel. You've made your point." I almost laughed. My point? My point hadn't even been made yet. "You don't get to decide when my point has been made," I said. "You forfeited that right when you toasted yourselves in Paris while I stood alone at my wedding." She started crying, soft at first, then louder, like she thought she could guilt me into backing down. I hung up mid-sob. The eviction deadline loomed. I drove up to Columbia the day before it expired, parking across the street from the store. Through the plate glass windows, I saw the chaos boxes stacked to the ceiling, furniture wrapped in plastic, employees moving like ghosts. My father's face was pale, his shoulders slumped. My mother sat on a stool in the corner, staring at the floor. Allison was pacing, phone pressed to her ear, probably telling someone her psycho sister had ruined her family. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching. It wasn't gloating, it was taking inventory. They had taken something from me that could never be replaced, the memory of my wedding day as it should have been. In return, I was dismantling the thing they valued most. When they finally carried the last load out, I walked across the street. My father froze when he saw me. My mother's mouth fell open. I stopped in front of them, close enough to see the lines around their eyes, the defeat in their expressions. "You took a trip to Europe," I said quietly. "I took your crown jewel. I guess we're both collectors now." My father looked like he wanted to speak, but no words came. My mother's eyes filled with tears again, but I didn't care. I walked past them into the empty store. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Without the antiques, the space felt larger, hollow. I ran my hand along the counter where my father had once counted cash, where I had stood as a child watching him haggle with customers. Now it was mine. I locked the door behind me and pocketed the keys. That night, back in Savannah, I stood on my porch again, wine glass in hand. The air was cooler, the sky streaked with stars. The eviction was done, but the plan wasn't over. My parents thought losing their store was the end of it, but I was only getting started. They still had 5 other locations, a name with some value, and a reputation I could erode piece by piece. Revenge isn't a single strike, it's a dismantling. And I had all the time in the world. The day they moved their last load out of Davenport Antiques, I arrived early and parked across the street. The morning air in Columbia was cool, the kind that hinted spring was only half committed to arriving. I leaned against my car, sipping coffee, and watched them struggle. My father shuffled toward the truck carrying a heavy oak chest. His shoulders looked smaller somehow, diminished. My mother walked behind him, clutching a cardboard box, her silk scarf fluttering like a flag in retreat. Allison was there too, snapping orders at the few remaining employees, her hair pulled into a perfect ponytail that didn't match the panic in her eyes. When my mother's gaze lifted and found me across the street, she froze. Her face crumpled, tears tracing lines through the makeup she'd tried so hard to keep perfect. My father didn't say a word, he just set the chest in the truck bed and turned away. I crossed the street slowly, deliberately, heels tapping against the pavement. The sound made Allison glance up, and the instant she saw me, her mouth twisted into a sneer. "You really came to watch?" she spat. "Yes," I said. My voice was calm, almost gentle, and that seemed to unsettle her more than if I'd shouted. I stopped a few feet from them, looking each of them in the eye. "You took a trip to Europe," I said evenly. "I took your crown jewel. I guess we're both collectors now." They had nothing to say. My mother's lip trembled, Allison's face flushed red. My father just climbed into the driver's seat of the truck without meeting my eyes. I turned my back on them and walked toward the building. The eviction was done, but I wasn't finished, not yet. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The shop was empty now, the hardwood floors bare except for dust and a few stray nails. The silence was thick, the air still carrying faint traces of furniture polish and old wood. I walked the perimeter slowly, trailing my fingers along the walls. This place had been their pride for years. Now it was mine. But possession alone wasn't enough. True revenge meant leaving nothing behind for them to rebuild from. I went upstairs to the office, a small room overlooking the street. The desk was gone, but the outline it had left in the carpet remained. I stood there for a long moment, imagining my father sitting here, counting profits, boasting to customers about the prestige of owning a store in this prime location. I imagined my mother holding court downstairs, charming tourists into overpaying for dusty trinkets. Allison would pop in occasionally, pretending to help but really just looking for attention. I pulled out my phone and made a call I'd been planning for weeks. The buyer answered on the second ring. "It's yours," I said. "The whole building. All cash, closing in 2 weeks." The buyer, a man expanding his chain of modern furniture stores, had been circling for a month.
He was eager, willing to pay far more than I'd spent. I didn't need the profit.
I wanted the symbolism. I wouldn't just take their store, I'd erase it entirely, replace it with something that would make them wince every time they drove past. After the call, I left the building for the last time, locking the door and slipping the keys into my coat pocket. That evening, back in Savannah, I sat at my desk and opened my leather-bound journal. Operation Silence before the storm had spanned months, each move deliberate. But now we were entering the final phase. I'd dismantled their most profitable store. The next step was to corrode their reputation so completely that even their remaining shops would wither. I started by contacting a journalist I knew from Charleston, an acquaintance who owed me a favor. I fed him a carefully crafted story, a behind-the-scenes look at how antique dealers manipulated prices, including specific examples that pointed directly at Davenport Antiques. I gave him invoices, supplier emails, and photographs, all of it real and all of it damning. The article hit a week later, splashed across the lifestyle section, the tarnished shine of Davenport Antiques. It was devastating. Social media lit up with customers demanding refunds, former employees telling their own stories of underpayment and exploitation. I didn't stop there. I called their landlords for the other 5 shops, posing as a potential tenant. I hinted that Davenport Antiques might be closing locations soon due to serious financial trouble. Landlords hate instability. Within 2 weeks, 2 of the properties were listed for lease, and my parents were scrambling. Allison sent me a string of texts in all caps. "You're ruining news. This isn't funny, you're sick," I replied once. "It's not supposed to be funny." The last blow came quietly. I knew my parents had a business line of credit tied to their home. Through a mutual contact in their bank, I learned they'd drawn heavily on it to cover the losses from the Columbia store closure. I also learned the bank was reviewing their credit risk. A few well-placed suggestions to the right people, and their line of credit was suspended pending review. The phone call from my mother came the next night. Her voice was hoarse, exhausted. "We're going to lose the house, Janet. Are you happy now?" For a moment I just listened to her breathing, then I said, No, I'll be happy when you finally understand that family isn't just blood. It's who shows up. And you didn't? I hung up before she could answer. 2 months later, Davenport Antiques closed its final location. The house went on the market not long after. The modern furniture store opened in the Columbia building under bright lights and a minimalist design that made my parents' old shop seem like a relic in every sense. On opening day, I drove up to see it. The sign was new, the windows spotless. Customers bustled in and out, oblivious to the history beneath their feet. I stood across the street, coffee in hand, just as I had months before. This time, there was no one to glare at me, no one to beg or plead. I had won, completely. Revenge wasn't sweet. It was precise, calculated, inevitable. And it had been worth every step. As I turned to leave, I felt lighter than I had in years. The storm was over. I had been the thunder, the lightning, and the flood. And nothing they could do would ever wash away the ruin I had left behind.